Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Jessica Thompson. She's Assistant Professor of Anthropology at Yale University. She specializes in human evolution, and especially those aspects that can be revealed through the analysis of ancient animal bones found at archaeological sites, that is, zooarchaeology. She leads the Malawi Ancient Lifeways and Peoples project in Malawi, Central Africa, where she has maintained a field site since 2009. So, Dr. Thompson, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thanks very much.
Okay, so tell us first about that Malawi project. I mean, what are the kinds of things you're studying there? Does it involve different tribes or what exactly?
Yeah, so the project was something that has evolved itself. And I actually used to lead a project. The one that I began in 2009 had a different name, and it was in a slightly different part of Malawi, and it also dealt with different time periods. So I got into the area because I was actually doing a road trip from Southern Africa, where I was busy working on my dissertation. This was back in, I guess, 2005. And I drove up to the Serengeti, where I was working on an archaeological site in Tanzania. And I noticed that there hadn't actually been a lot of archaeological work that had been reported for the time period that I specialized in the areas in between. And I thought that was kind of peculiar. So as I was driving through, I kind of kept my eyes open and went and poked around in the literature and realized that there were lots of sites that were dating to this period of time known as the Middle Stone Age, which has developed some notoriety for being the period when we apparently see the origins of sort of typical human behaviors that you can really pin down as things that humans do that are quite unique in comparison to other animals. And this is things like symbolic behavior, really complex technology. And in fact, there's a lot of research that it continues to be ongoing in that area. So I wanted to know what the evidence was in that particular part of Africa, given that we have a lot of data from Southern Africa and Eastern Africa. And I found that there wasn't a lot. So I started working there for that reason. And after working on a project that was completely to do with the Middle Stone Age, I started to become a little bit disillusioned with the fact that there weren't any fossils that were preserved in the deposits where we were working. So there's this marvelous record of stone artifacts, and we've published a bunch of things about that. But as you mentioned, I'm a zooarchaeologist and I like to deal with animal bones. So I started trying to find ways in which I could apply those skills again. And that's when I started the Malawi Ancient Lifeways and Peoples project, which is also in northern Malawi, but it necessarily deals with the kinds of sites that are likely to preserve animal remains, which in that particular part of Africa are just going to be more recent sites. And so the kind of question focus shifted from the origin of modern humans to more issues of how was it that after modern human populations had been established across the continent of Africa, how then did they begin to interact both with one another and then also with their environments?
Mhm. But are you only interested in the archaeology or do you also study contemporary hunter-gatherers?
Yeah, so I don't personally actually do any of that work. I'm a consumer of that literature. So I know that in my sort of on my project description, or I should say on my profile, I say that I use hunter-gatherer ethnography, and that's probably a misnomer in the sense that I'm basically use hunter-gatherer behavioral ecology to try to understand and interpret the archaeological record. But fundamentally, I am an archaeologist, and I lead archaeological projects. I recover archaeological remains, and those are my primary kinds of evidence that I use.
Mhm. Did you learn something new about our evolutionary history by studying these different archaeological sites in Malawi?
I would say so. I mean, there's a couple of things that people think of when they think of evolution. They often think of, this sort of linear marching of progress, which for many reasons is not an accurate way to think about it. But one of the things that a lot of people don't really consider about evolution is the fact that behaviors can evolve too, and of course cultural behaviors are one of the things that humans do, and they can change over time. So we can use the archaeological record to look at that. And it's not necessarily always separate from biological evolution. And yet, at the same time, it does kind of give us this extra avenue that we can explore when we're trying to understand really fundamental changes in human behavior and then how they link to the biological changes.
And did that tell you anything about our origins? Like, for example, I know because I've already talked with several anthropologists on the show that some people say that the evidence points toward we having evolved from a single population in Africa. Others say it was multiple populations. So, what is your take on that?
Yeah, I was one of the many authors on the paper in Tree, which is the journal where that was published, that does try to make the argument that there are multiple potential places in Africa that likely contributed different aspects to both our biological and our behavioral evolution. So I guess, by default, you have to assume that that's the stance that I take. But it is a stance that I kind of came to, I think, like many of my colleagues, in sort of a roundabout way, because at first when we're sort of training in this and we're trying to understand how does the modern human behavioral record from Africa compare to better understood and better researched records like, say, Neanderthals in Europe. And then we start to look for signs that we might be able to detect, when do some of these really important behaviors begin and where do they begin? And then it starts to become this matter of, okay, well, Africa is a really big place. So maybe we should stop thinking about Africa versus the rest of Europe and Asia, but we should start thinking about the particular parts of Africa that might have been most conducive to producing to producing humans, both in terms of our biological and behavioral evolution. And then when you actually begin to find more data and more data reported and published, and then also the dating gets better, so you can understand when a lot of these things began. It actually becomes a little more confusing, because no longer is it this sort of straightforward picture of well, humans evolved in Africa and maybe it was in southern Africa or maybe it was in eastern Africa. But what you actually see is that the fossils have a lot of diversity across the continent, but it's often difficult to say, yes, this is definitely a population of modern humans, and that's not, because they have overlapping characteristics in terms of just their morphology and how they look. But then there aren't that many fossils, so it's also difficult to know if you're maybe just looking at some extremes in morphological variation that happen to have gotten preserved in the fossil record and then again happen to have gotten recovered. So when you really compare the state of the fossil record in Africa to somewhere like Europe, there just haven't been that many things that have been found, and that makes it difficult to interpret. But when you do look at it, it looks like there's quite a bit of variation. And the same thing goes with the behavior. When you look at the archaeological evidence, you see a lot of differences across the continent. And there are sort of underlying similarities in terms of, for example, we see shell beads starting in the northern part of Africa. We see them also in the southern part of Africa at pretty similar time periods. And both of those are indicators of personal ornamentation, symbolic behavior, personal expression, things that other animals don't do. So these are quite exciting to archaeologists trying to understand the origins of these. But they occur, at totally different places in the continent. So the propensity to do this must have been there throughout the continent, but just not necessarily manifested or, let's say, recovered by archaeologists to the same extent. So I guess that's the long answer. The short answer is that I think that there's a lot of evidence from both the behavioral side and also the biological side that there are numerous parts of Africa that probably played a role in our emergence. And it's going to be kind of a futile exercise to continue to try to pinpoint the one spot that sort of gave rise to us all.
So earlier you mentioned that people tend to have this wrong idea that our evolutionary history is linear, in the sense that we evolved from one species that evolved from another and so on and so forth. But did we evolve from a single species or not?
See, this is the problem is actually just how do you define a species in the first place? Modern biologists have trouble defining species, even when they have access to high quality genetic data, behavioral data, and large populations that they can work with, as well as, decades of actual observation of these organisms in their habitats. So what hope could we possibly have dealing with just a fossil here and a fossil there to accurately be able to figure out which one is a different species from another one? And, that's a little bit of a rhetorical question, because obviously paleontologists and human paleontologists, so who actually recover human fossils, they do try to do this. And there are certain points at which you can say, okay, well, the differences between this one and that one are so substantial that it's reasonable to consider them to be different species. And, this becomes sort of an argument, a semantic argument in some ways between people who have different opinions on things. But you can definitely see over time big changes, and you can see big trends in how this all played out. And what seems to be the case is that you see lots of diversity in the fossil record going back, particularly between 2 and 4 million years ago. Lots of different taxa that you could probably not have a lot of argument about them being different species, but coexisting at the same time and in the same places. And then you kind of see a contraction in that diversity, and then you see an expansion again over the course of the last few ice age cycles. So the most familiar diversity that most people know is, of course, like the Neanderthals in Europe, Denisovans in Asia. There's these things that people call hobbits, Homo floresiensis in Indonesia, and there's actually more than that. So it looks like the kind of story of human evolution has been one in which we have just been one of many lineages that have been evolving simultaneously in lots of different parts of the world. And ultimately what the mystery is how it is that it could come to pass that after all of that, we're now the only one that's still here. And, that's kind of wrapped up in this question of what does it mean to be human? How did we develop the kinds of behavioral and biological adaptations that have made us so successful compared to all of these other hominins that we know once did exist?
Mhm. But we all, Homo sapiens originated in Africa, or is it the case? I know that we interbred with other species like Neanderthals, Denisovans, but when it comes to our origins, is it all from Africa or not?
Currently, that seems to be the case. All of the oldest fossils that have been attributed to Homo sapiens come from Africa. All of the genetic evidence based on living populations of people also come from Africa and point to Africa as the origin point. And there's a couple of different reasons for that. There are genetic estimates that show the largest populations have always been in Africa. There are also genetic evidence estimates that show that the deepest lineages come from Africa. And this isn't just one study here or one study there, but this is study after study after study performed using all kinds of different methods that are continually being assessed and updated. And they still point to that same result. Where I think there's a little bit of ambiguity now is at what point in time early modern humans began to disperse out of Africa and start to mix, because it used to be kind of the contrasting models were, well, did we evolve all the way across the world? And that was known as the multi-regional model, where you'd have modern human populations sort of simultaneously arising in Europe, in Asia, and in Africa. And then that was contrasted with the strict out of Africa model, in which we kind of arose at one point in one place in Africa and then just sort of took over the rest of the world. And I think the reality is always going to have been more nuanced than that, but that's certainly what the data are pointing to now, which is that although definitively we did all originally come from the African continent, it's now not very clear exactly where in the African continent that would have been, and also when. And at what point in time these various populations of early modern humans would have actually started to interact with populations like Neanderthals, because it might not have just been one wave coming from Africa. It's not necessarily the case that we sort of evolved in Africa and then took off and expanded into the rest of the world. It's now looking a lot more like sort of a leaky tap, where we're constantly sort of just sputtering out and then finding ourselves mixing and encountering with whoever else was living there. But the majority of the population was always within the African continent.
Mm-hmm. So, when you talk about modern humans, what are you referring to exactly? What is the time frame we're talking about here?
You have great questions because these are the inbuilt assumptions that we have when we use words that seem obvious, like a modern human. Even that is kind of a loaded term. And the earliest known fossil that is agreed upon by most researchers as being most likely from a population of early modern humans is from northern Africa, and it dates to about 315,000 years ago. So that individual fossil and then the other fossils, with it that are probably part of the same population, they, they don't look exactly like if you were to take all of the global variation of modern humans today, and we're quite a variable species morphologically. If you were to take all of that variation, they wouldn't map perfectly in the middle of that, but they do enough overlap with what you would consider to be, in the face and in the shape of the skull. They find overlap with modern humans in a number of different ways, enough so that you could say, okay, well, this is probably reasonably something that was a part of that population. And so I guess that's kind of what I mean when I say early modern human is an individual who is part of a population that likely had some sort of genetic input to the living populations of humans you see today. And you can't know specifically, yes, definitely this population was an ancestor, but they would have been a part of the broader population of similar looking and similar appearing hominins at the time. And when I say hominin, I'm using that term to kind of differentiate between, a lot of people say humans, meaning, and they have this very specific idea in their head about what a human should be, and some people would include Neanderthals in that, and some people would not. So I'm just using hominins to kind of just be generic, as just all of those human-like creatures that were alive at one point in the not so distant past.
Mm-hmm. But 350,000 years ago, are we already talking about Homo sapiens or not?
Yes, that's right. Sorry, I should have specified that. So that would be a fossil that most people would be comfortable assigning to Homo sapiens.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, modern humans, is it that they are anatomically similar to us or also behaviorally?
Yeah, that's the other issue, is sometimes people use the term AMH, which stands for anatomically modern humans. And
Mm-hmm.
even that is kind of a strange term, because we're usually just talking about the head and the face. And there aren't a lot of preserved heads and faces that are in really great shape dating to 315,000 years ago, or even more recently. So fossils are hard to come by that are complete enough for us to really get a great sense of what the range of variation was like at any particular time slice. But when people talk about anatomically modern, we're kind of thinking about the whole body. But what you really find realistically in the fossil record is bits and pieces of the bodies that look exactly like you would see in, if you were to go out into a cemetery and find a person still buried there today. They look the same. And then in terms of the face, again, they overlap in some really important ways with the range of variation you see today, but you wouldn't look at them necessarily and say, that absolutely looks exactly like my neighbor. It's just kind of what you would expect if you're looking at an earlier version of the kind of variation that you see globally today, with 315,000 years of evolution in between. So when we say anatomically modern, that's usually what we're talking about, is kind of like basically what does the face look like? Is the brain size the same size as ours? And yes, it was. And when people talk about behavioral modernity, that's usually where the archaeology comes in. And you start to think about, okay, well, did they have things like symbolism? Did they have language? Did they communicate with each other in ways that we would recognize as fundamentally human? The question kind of loosely is one like, is it basically the level of difference where you would go into a culture that you're unfamiliar with and say, yeah, this is a different culture? Or would you go into, the past and encounter one of these people and say, this is not just a different culture, this is like a totally different kind of being? That's really kind of the difference that people are thinking about when they talk about early modern humans. And so we would mean, yeah, it would look like somebody that just had a different culture from us.
Some people talk about the so-called cognitive revolution 50,000 to 75,000 years ago, where things like art and religious artifacts and other things like that start popping up in several different places. I mean, is that accurate?
Well, I think not. I have a pretty strong stance on this, and I know this is the Dissenter program, so I'm supposed to dissent. So here I am dissenting. And that's kind of an older model that comes from what had been discovered in the archaeological record at that particular point in time. So this would have been the late 90s and maybe a little bit in the early 2000s. But by the late 90s, that was a really strong model because it was based on the archaeological record as it stood then. And the thing is, the Middle Stone Age was not a very exciting time period for most people to work in at that time. They kind of thought, well, the stone tools, they all look pretty similar to each other. It seems like, they were sort of modern looking people, but we don't see really exciting art or ornaments or, things that, carved bone artifacts. And so, there was this kind of idea from that all of that didn't come until later on in time. And that was linked up to some pretty Eurocentric views of where this revolution would have taken place. And that's because a lot of the really early European record for modern humans in Europe does have a lot of that stuff in it. But it's also later, it's all later than 40,000 years ago. So there was always this kind of mystery of, well, where did it come from? And then when those kinds of artifacts started to actually be discovered in Africa, it became clear that that was the source of the capacity to have all of these kinds of symbolic expressions. And that one of the biggest obstacles had always just been preservation, because things don't preserve as well in the kinds of environments in Africa where people were looking. You have these nice big deep caves in Europe that preserve artifacts and bones and fossils just better than any other kind of environment, and you don't have a lot of those in Africa. And then also people were focusing their research in Africa. And as soon as that started to happen, now there's a lot of people working on this problem, and this kind of stuff is coming out from lots of different sites. So it's no longer just one unusual site at the bottom of Africa that seems to be showing unusually early bone tools or unusually early ornaments. There are sites all across the continent that now have early evidence for the use of pigments at 350,000 years ago. There is actually just a paper that was published earlier, I think this week, if not last week, on the symbolic use of crystals. That was in southern Africa, dating to 100,000 years ago. So really what it starts to look like is that when you actually put the research effort in and find those places that have better preservation, it's very clear that there's this incremental increase in the ways in which early modern humans, if I can use that term, began to engage in these kinds of behaviors and actually incorporate them into their lives in such a way that it actually became quite important to their day-to-day life. So yeah, I would definitely say that the evidence is a much more incremental evidence rather than a revolution, and that it absolutely is early and it absolutely begins in Africa.
So I'm not sure if this is too over a general question. Perhaps we should focus on particular traits. But since you're an archaeologist, don't you agree that sometimes, at least, we have to be a little bit careful in terms of the inferences we make about how the minds of ancient hunter-gatherers, human societies, worked based on the archaeological record? I mean, because, for example, if I see a piece of art there, I mean, how can I be sure that about what was going on on that person's mind when they were creating that piece of art, for example?
Yeah, I agree with you that I think we need to be really careful when we think about how to interpret art and its meaning. But in terms of interpreting, is it art? I think that's a lot more of a solid foundation. And maybe it's better to even sort of modify using the term art and instead think of symbolic behavior, just broadly construed, especially as manifested materially. So taking an object and imbuing it with some sort of significance that has meaning to you and that has some sort of shared meaning to someone else, either in your own group or elsewhere. And I think from an archaeological perspective, we can get at that in a number of different ways. First of all, if you find objects that are way out of context that don't have any reason to be there naturally, or if they have been clearly modified through some sort of human agency, like with pigments, if they've been ground or if they've been polished, that's a really good indication that someone was doing something with that object. They were intentionally collecting them and they were bringing them there, and then they were modifying them in some manner. So we won't necessarily know why they were doing that in the sense of what meaning it had to them, but it had to have some meaning, otherwise they wouldn't have done it. And we don't see that kind of behavior in other organisms, except occasionally there are some birds that will collect odd, shiny things and use them to decorate and actually display to mates doing this. So you might point to that and say, well, aren't, humans just basically behaving in the same way? And, there's a little bit of a philosophical argument there. But what you start to see is that when people are decorating themselves and displaying using these kind of external material symbols in a consistent manner, you have a pretty clear idea that has meaning. And we can argue about whether it has meaning in the same way that birds do this, if we want to argue about that. But what we see archaeologically is a huge diversity in the kinds of ways in which people express essentially the same behavior. So they're using these kinds of objects to symbolize something to somebody else. And with the pigments, it's kind of interesting because it's not just, we went and we gathered them here and we thought they were shiny and pretty, but like these pigments that are found in Eastern Africa dating to 315,000 years ago, these are transported from very long distances. And they're also transporting things like stone, obsidian, volcanic glass, which is, a highly sought after commodity because it fractures and makes a really nice sharp edge. That stuff is being transported for tens, 20s, 30 kilometers more in some cases, I think more than 100 kilometers, even that long ago. So either people are moving extremely far, much farther than we ever have seen a modern human group move, or they're trading and they're actually moving things down the line and they're exchanging objects. And so this is a behavior we really actually don't see in other animals at all. And when you kind of put it all together into a package, it has a lot of different pieces to it that are very convincing that this must have had meaning to people in the past. But what that meaning is, I think, is when you start to get into some more dangerous territory.
Did the last ice age have any important impact in our evolution? Did it change the way we evolved?
So there's really the ice ages is kind of what we think about, and the answer is absolutely, because the ice ages started 2.6 million years ago. So that's that's the entirety of the genus Homo, and there have been tons of changes in that particular interval. So you see the emergence of our genus, you see lots of transformations, diversification of species, you see us beginning to develop a fully modern body plan and so on. But I think what you're trying to ask about really is the most recent glacial cycle. And the most recent glacial cycle probably was important in terms of the way that it configured populations of people around the world, but those populations were already in place by the last ice age. So it kind of depends on which ice age you want to pick as the one that's going to be the most significant at that point in time in shaping human evolution. So if we look back, the world has been characterized over the last 2.6 million years as having these kind of wild swings, you might even say, in global temperature, and then the climate impacts that's had have varied depending on where you are on the planet. And so in Africa, you don't usually have the advancement of big glaciers, except for where you have really high elevations, but it's more about shifts in the amount of precipitation, the seasonality of precipitation, and all of the impact that would have had on the vegetation communities and then the animal communities that follow them. And the emergence of Homo sapiens took place, over the course of the last, say, 11 or 12 of these cycles. And what you see is that would have had an influence on the ways in which people were able to organize themselves vis-a-vis their environments. And when you were asking about the emergence of modern humans as a single population or from multiple parts of Africa, this has got to be a big part of that story, where you have these changing configurations of environments that are moving people around and causing them to fragment, and then they kind of undergo their own evolutionary trajectory there. They innovate new things behaviorally. They have a few genetic mutations that are unique to that population. And then as the climate changes again and it brings people back into contact regularly with one another, then they swap both the information and the genetic material. And this happens over the course of many cycles, and eventually you end up with us. And then we end up everywhere around the world, ultimately. So the very last glacial cycle was really just the last time that we kind of went through that. But by that point, we already had modern humans all the way across the world and on all the continents that are currently inhabited.
Mhm. So we spread across the world and different populations evolved in different environments. And so we have, for example, different anatomies, different aspects of our physiology that differ between populations. But is that enough for us to say that race is a scientific concept?
No. I'm going to just be very straightforward with that, because race is a completely socially loaded construct that is defined differently depending on what cultural perspective you have. And so by its sort of very nature, it can't be something that is scientifically demonstrable. But you're right that there are differences biologically between populations of people who live in various parts of the world, and that's a legacy of having evolved separately from one another to a certain extent. So let's say populations at the southern tip of southern Africa, they're not going to be regularly exchanging genes with people who have in prehistory lived, let's say, in island Southeast Asia. There's just too much geographical distance there. Of course, this is changing now very rapidly, because now people can move anywhere as quickly as they want to. And I think that's going to have some really interesting implications for the homogenization of people as we go forward in time. But to talk about distinct races is impossible, because all of this genetic material is a gradation. And so as you move kind of across geographic distance, you don't see clear, distinct divisions between populations. You see gradations. And every once in a while, you'll have groups that, for cultural reasons often, or because they're geographically separate, they might have been a bit more isolated from other groups of people. But that doesn't make them a different race, because the term race itself is, again, it's a socially loaded construct. So, what we have to do is completely separate this concept of biological populations from the social construct of race, and think more kind of about the process of how it is that humans have evolved this incredible diversity in the way we look, and then also our cultural diversity over what is really kind of a pretty short time span. And when you have the archaeological data and then now ancient DNA that's contributing to that, you can really get a much clearer picture of how that's all started to play out. And there have been some pretty dramatic changes in human population history, just even over the last few thousand years. And as you go back in time, depending on where your quality of data come from, you can see that that has been an ongoing theme since we've essentially become human.
Mm-hmm. So should we use the term population or ancestry, for example? Because, I mean, at least some of these differences are important in some domains, like, for example, medicine. Different people from different populations have different susceptibilities to different diseases. So, I mean, it's also important to recognize those differences, right?
So you could argue that that's the case, and a lot of people do, and that's why that has become embedded in a lot of medical practice. But what tends to happen is that the way it's implemented is almost a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. So you will have, and I can direct you to some recent critiques of this exact issue, which are very interesting, because you have population differences. But then the trouble is, if you're a medical professional, you're not treating a population, you're treating an individual. And so when that individual walks through your door, and you make assumptions about their biological ancestry based on, let's say, how they look or what box they tick on the form, you could potentially be missing a whole lot of other aspects of their treatment that are specific to that individual and that individual's population history. And this is especially problematic in a place like the United States. Like, let's say we look at the various people who live here and we make assumptions about their race or their racial background. Or we don't even make assumptions, but we actually go to their self-identification, the box that they tick. And we don't know all of the various people who have contributed to their ancestry, and we don't know their ancestries. And so making a set of assumptions about how that individual is representative of the average, I think, creates this sort of fallacy where you could mistreat them and not necessarily think about some of the other ways in which they might be having a medical issue that could be treated based on some of the sort of so-called hidden genetic ancestry that might not be obvious from just looking at them or even talking to them about how they perceive themselves. So I think using this concept of race in medicine is extremely problematic because of the way it's implemented. Not necessarily to say that there aren't, on average, some biological differences between populations, but when you cement it like that and you make it its own entity, I think that you're just asking for trouble. And there are always going to be disparities in the ways in which different people receive treatment as they come into a medical practice based on that.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. So could it be also the case that some medical research is also biased in that direction, in terms of assuming that people with certain characteristics have particular ancestries?
Yes, absolutely. And I think another issue too is that I mentioned a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you can link particular genes to particular kinds of disorders, and then you can link the prevalence of particular genes to people who have specific kinds of biological ancestry. It doesn't mean that everybody in that population has the same gene or the same ancestry. But by making those linkages, you might say, okay, well, there's a sort of a statistical argument to be made that maybe we should be looking at these populations differently. The trouble is there are lots of environmental factors that go into a human's health. And so if you're looking at something like, let's say, hypertension, yes, there can be genetic bases for hypertension, and people may be more susceptible to it based on whatever their genetic particular code is, and then that code might be more commonly found in one particular population over another. But then the trouble is that hypertension also has a lot of environmental factors that feed into it too. And a lot of those environmental factors are shaped by the society in which you live. So I'm not just talking about the environment like the sun and the rain or whatever, but the social environment, the treatment that somebody has experienced throughout their lifespan, the kind of way in which they are interacting day to day with people, the level of stress that they receive can contribute to something like hypertension. So if you're the target of systematic racism, let's say, that's not necessarily because of your genes. That could be because of a combination of genes and social environment. It could be just the social environment. And when you kind of set up your medical studies to test those kinds of things, you have all these confounding variables that you can't really untangle. And the trouble is you don't necessarily know what it is that's causing a condition like, let's say, hypertension. So I think that there's not enough nuance in the way that these studies are set up, and it tends to gloss over the environmental impacts. And this is one of the things that is starting to really emerge a lot about kind of just thinking about the intersection between health and the actual environment. If you grow up in a particular set of circumstances, you might be exposed to certain toxins more than another group of people. That could be because of your positioning socially. There's lots of things that just aren't necessarily considered, but that can become all tangled up. And then it looks like you have a nice clean-cut result, and it's actually not.
Right. So how good are contemporary hunter-gatherer societies as models of ancient ones? Because that's also a topic that is very disputed in anthropology, right?
Yes, it definitely is. And your questions are really, we're covering a lot of territory here. This is exciting. And this is actually why I love this, because you can't think about humans, human biology as separate from human culture. And the kind of the biological history and the population history has so much to do with the very specific ways in which we interface with our environments. And this is often via culture, through our behavior, or through material culture, so our tools. And a lot of the assumptions that are made when we try to use observations from living hunter-gatherers to try to interpret the archaeological record, in theory, they're supposed to be observations that help us in looking at kind of the universality of human behavior, and how it is that humans, let's say, what kind of a decision would you make on a day-to-day basis if you lived in this environment and you were confronted with these various decisions and you needed to go out, let's say, and hunt something or gather something, or stop yourself from getting sick. What are the kinds of ways in which humans just do that? And I think going to hunter-gatherers to try to see how it is that they cope with those issues is going to be critical to trying to interpret a past that we can't observe anymore. And the reality, though, is that most contemporary hunter-gatherers live in environments where essentially other people haven't wanted to take them away. So they've been kind of moved into the most marginal of environments that aren't good for agriculture and that aren't good for pastoralism. And then they're surrounded by groups of people who practice these kinds of subsistence, and they're usually deeply embedded in trade networks that involve those systems. So it would be a fallacy to try to approach the contemporary hunter-gatherer record as if it's some sort of relic or fossil of the past, and you can directly observe what people are doing now and then map that straight onto what you see archaeologically. But I do think that it's also a critical tool for being able to interpret the archaeological record, because that was what we did for the majority of our evolution. And in order to try to figure out how it was that people kind of behave when they're confronted with a particular set of problems is not as accessible when you're looking at urbanized people living in large scale societies. So it kind of depends on what question you're asking. I think sometimes it can be applied appropriately, and sometimes it can be really problematic, especially if you take that stance that these are sort of like isolated groups of people who are like living fossils. That's not going to be helpful.
Mm-hmm. I understand, but I mean these two different factors, let's say, of modern societies pushing these hunter-gatherer societies to marginal environments, and also perhaps the fact that they're not really isolated, but they interact with people from industrialized societies, and they are also in a way influenced by them. I mean, does this also alter their sociality?
That's a great question. And I think, the answer has to be yes. I think that's kind of what humans do, is we adapt and we change according to the ways in which our environments, including our social environments, change around us. And, one of the biggest puzzles too, archaeologically, is that when you go back and look at the archaeological record, you see concentrations of sites in, guess what, the most excellent habitats, the most productive environments, the ones that have the most resources, the ones that you can reconstruct the paleo environment and say, yes, this would have been a great place to live. You would have access to, all of these kinds of food, plenty of water, whatever it is that humans need to survive. And indeed, when you look archaeologically, you see that that's where the evidence is that there are the largest and most, long-term populations of our ancestors. And then you go to the contemporary hunter-gatherer record, and you see that they're living in very different kinds of environments now. And it really does create this kind of disconnect between trying to understand how humans would operate in an environment that's essentially really different from where most of the archaeological evidence is. And what you can try to do is you can draw from historical records or observations that people made when there were just more hunter-gatherers alive on the planet, still living as hunter-gatherers. And it's not ideal, because you're relying on sort of early explorer accounts and things like that. It's not systematic observation of human behavior, but it can give you some clues as to things like how big would the populations have gotten? How did they organize themselves socially when resources were really rich in an area versus when resources were dispersed? How did they respond to problems like a drought? There are hints of those kinds of things that you can get from historical documents. And then looking at contemporary hunter-gatherers, you can kind of say, all right, times of hardship, broadly defined, how do they cope? And if they're coping by trading with people who are not necessarily also hunter-gatherers, that doesn't mean that that's not a human mechanism for coping that you can't attempt to apply to the archaeological record. It just means that it might not have taken the exact same form that you see people doing today.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so perhaps this will be the last topic to explore today. You've published a recent study where you studied the effects that anthropogenic fire have had on particular environments. Could you tell us about that?
Yes, gladly. So this is cool because it comes back to the very beginning of our conversation, where I first got started working in Malawi in southern Central Africa. And, I mentioned that I was drawn to that region because, well, it was beautiful, and I wanted to work there. And I was greeted by a number of very friendly people, and I thought this could be a really interesting place to work. But then archaeologically, it turned out to be particularly interesting because what we found is we had positioned our research project right next to the shores of Lake Malawi, which is this huge freshwater lake. And it's the very southern part of the African Rift Valley. So the Rift Valley goes all the way up from Ethiopia and it runs all the way down through Malawi. And then there's this big lake that's there. It's a massive lake. Often there are days when you can't see the other side of the lake. And so there had been a group of people, paleoenvironmental scientists, who had in 2005 gone onto that lake and they put a big core down. They took this barge and modified it and they drilled down and they pulled out a whole bunch of mud, nice and stratified. And then you can go back down through all of those layers of mud and you can do things like count how much pollen was there from all of the different species of trees and bushes and things that were living in the region. And the pollen all kind of blows into the lake. So over time you get kind of this average of what was tree composition like? What was grass composition like? How did it change over time? Then you sample those same layers to figure out how old they are. You sample those same layers to figure out what was going on with the lake in terms of, were lake levels dropping or falling, dropping or rising. And what they were able to do is reconstruct that there had been a series of very prolonged, very intense arid intervals in that region. And we were talking earlier about kind of glacial cycles. And they don't map perfectly onto glacial cycles, but they also do occur in a cyclical way. So the climate was definitely undergoing some pretty dramatic changes in the Lake Malawi basin. And I was having this conversation with the person who had been responsible for counting the pollen there. And I had started working in that part of northern Malawi because I was drawn to the fact that there was this huge archaeological landscape of Middle Stone Age artifacts. And we had spent years excavating these artifacts and going around and putting in pits and dating them. And we thought we were going to be dealing with the earlier part of the Middle Stone Age, which was my area of interest. I talked about the emergence of modern humans at 315,000 years ago. I talked about this early evidence for the early trade of obsidian, also 300,000 years ago. That was a time period that was intensely interesting to me. And we dug and we dug and we dug and we couldn't find anything that dated that to that time period. And it was very frustrating to me. We kept finding loads of sites, but they were all dating to within the last 100,000 years. So I was kind of complaining to the person who had studied the pollen. And she said, I said, all of our sites are mostly dating to within the last 100,000 years. And then most of them are in the last 60,000 years. What's going on? Why are there so many sites there at this time? And she says, the last 60,000 years out of the last 600,000 years that I've studied is the most interesting time period. And I was like, what? No, that's not the origins of modern humans or anything like that. And she says, no, look what happens to the ecology. And we put our heads together. And what we could see is that right at the exact same time that we see this huge spike in archaeological site numbers, we are seeing, so there's just millions of artifacts, and everywhere you put a hole, there's artifacts. And you date them, and they're all coming back to the last 60,000 years. Right around that same time, you see that the pollen show a collapse in the tree species and the spread of these grasslands and these kind of open woodlands, which is what the environment looks like there today. And why that was unexpected is because previously, as you go back through that record, you're looking at all of these different cycles. And when the lake level had been high, that would indicate higher precipitation in the basin, and the trees would expand. And so the forest would expand and cover the whole area. And then the lake would drop, and then as the vegetation responds, you would lose the trees. And then they'd come back, and then they'd be gone, and they'd come back, and they'd be gone. And what happened in the last 60,000 years is the lake comes back, but the trees do not. And with it, we see this turnover in the way in which the charcoal record is ending up also in the lake record. So you can see that there's a change in fire regime at the same time that there's a complete turnover in terms of the forest giving way to these open woodlands and grasslands. So, and then you also see the archaeological record essentially beginning in the area at that time. It's not to say people weren't living in the region before, but our interpretation is that that's when people started to modify their environment so substantially that they actually caused that anomalous changeover and the loss of the forests. So I think we've got the earliest anthropogenic landscape. And I think that this is because humans in Africa had spent a lot of time already evolving in these various different environments. As we talked about, exchanging genes, exchanging ideas when climate conditions put them into contact with each other. And through that process, they developed an intimate knowledge of how to shape their ecologies and get the most out of it. And so my interpretation is that this is what we're actually seeing, is people using their new relationship with fire or using their long relationship with fire in a new way, intentionally to transform their environments so that they could extract more resources from them, and that they were doing this a very long time ago in Africa as hunter-gatherers and not as agriculturalists.
So can we talk about anthropogenic climate change in this case, or is that too early to talk about?
I mean, it's tempting, isn't it? Because there's a lot of excitement around this idea of the Anthropocene and are humans having such an impact on climate and even the geological record that we need to name a whole new epoch after ourselves. But, I think what we're looking at here is sort of the roots of the Anthropocene. So these are the sorts of behaviors that are critical to the later behaviors that did lead to the Anthropocene, if you want to call it it's not like it's a formally ratified term yet, but you see that over time, people are continually kind of learning how to be more effective at extracting resources. And what I like to think of this as is evidence that this is a very long process, that it's a hallmark of kind of what humans do as we transform our environments, that this has gone back to long ago, back when we were still sort of early populations of modern humans, and that what we're seeing now today is kind of just the ratcheting up of those behaviors that are essentially the same kinds of behaviors that started a long time ago.
Right. So, is there any evidence of this phenomenon occurring in other parts of the globe?
That's a great question, and that's kind of what I want to do next. Is I want to start digging into some of these paleoenvironmental records and then linking them to the archaeological records. And the trouble is, this has definitely been done in Australia and in North America, where you have people entering into new environments. So there's sort of a before people, after people effect. In the African context, you've always had people. And so when you start to see these kinds of things showing up in the paleoenvironmental record, you wouldn't necessarily expect it to show up in the same way everywhere, because it's going to be pretty, sometimes that's a strategy that works well in one environment but doesn't work really well in another environment. And so I wouldn't expect it to be like, if we don't see it, it means that people didn't know how to use fire properly. I don't think that's what it means at all. So although this has been done in other continents, they don't have the same long-term human occupation. So like in Australia, there's some evidence for this around maybe 45,000 years ago. In North America, there's evidence for this maybe around 15,000 years ago. But this would be the oldest in Africa. And what often happens too is you have the climate people doing their study and then referencing the archaeological data, or you have the archaeologists doing their study and then referencing the paleoclimate data. And not so commonly, you have two of them together, working together to try to say, okay, how can we actually make sense of our data in tandem instead of just sort of borrowing from one another's literature. And I really hope that that's something we'll see more of in the future.
And do we know if this has had any impact on other animal species? I mean, because when you were mentioning Australia and North America, one thing that immediately came to my mind was the extinction of megafauna. So I'm not sure if it could have been driven by that as well.
It's definitely been considered. And there's a lot of literature about the extinction of megafauna on both of those continents. And you're right, the timing is kind of suggestive. And essentially what the argument is this the so-called sort of climate anomaly argument. So that, there's something that's anomalous here that's happening. We don't have a ready explanation for it. It doesn't make sense in terms of what's happening climatically. And so therefore, there's some other axis to the problem that is influencing this pattern. And then if you go to the archaeological record, you might see that there's something anomalous there too. And then essentially you are talking about a coincidence, right? You can never prove this. But you can bring in lots of different lines of evidence simultaneously to interrogate the data and see if they form the most parsimonious explanation or not. And in our case, I think that's what we've got, but we don't have a fossil record, so we can see what kinds of impacts this would have directly had on animal populations in the region. But when you go to like the Australian record and the North American records, it's kind of the same thing. You look at the continent-wide impacts, and then you have this very specific lake core. And it's hard to link those two because they're at very different scales. But conceptually, you're right. There could be a kind of a domino effect or a butterfly effect from humans beginning to change their environments in some ways that only get picked up in very specific places, but then the kind of bigger impact is felt throughout the entire ecosystem. And I think that that's a very reasonable thing to infer and definitely merits further investigation.
Yeah, and perhaps we can also add that maybe another factor that drove the extinction of megafauna was us humans hunting them, right?
Yeah, potentially. And, this is a whole other set of arguments, and I know we're a bit limited on time, but, there's arguments about, was it direct hunting or was it hunting of juveniles that would have had an impact on these large-bodied mammal populations? And in places like North America and Australia, where there are the most, where there's been the most research on these issues, there are still people who will argue it both ways and say human hunting had nothing to do with it, or human hunting had everything to do with it. And then there are different kinds of pieces of evidence you would bring in to try to figure that out. And I think ultimately what we have to do is continue to improve the empirical record, but also improve our ability to model the impacts that these different things would have had. So we're never going to be able to go back in time and observe these ecosystems as they were collapsing, but they clearly did transform pretty seriously. And so I think through ecological modeling, we might be able to get a little bit closer to that answer. And, I don't want to necessarily commit one way or the other, but I would say the data are pretty suggestive that humans have big impacts on their environments and that we have had for a long time. And I would not be surprised if we had something to do with the demise of many megafauna species.
Right. Okay, so just before we go, would you like to tell people where they can find you on the internet or your work?
Oh, yeah, sure. I mean, the Yale website's the easiest way to find me. I have a research website, which I use so often that I can't actually remember the URL, but it's linked on the Yale Anthropology website. You'll be able to find it pretty easily. I try to update it, but I can't, I maintain it myself, so it's something I often forget to do. And one thing I want to do more now is, I have a Twitter account, but I haven't yet tweeted. So I'm thinking I need to start doing that. I had a YouTube video for a talk that I gave about a totally different subject that we didn't even talk about today. And that's been getting a few hits lately. So people can also find me there if they just, go into YouTube and search for Thompson, and then IHO, the Institute of Human Origins, and that video will come up too.
Okay, great. So I will be leaving links to all of that in the description box of the interview. And Dr. Thompson, it's been a real pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for taking the time to come on the show.
Sure, and thanks for all of the wide breadth of questions.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching this interview until the end. So it is thanks to people like you that the show has been running for such a long time, more than 3 years now. And I would like to ask you to please pay a visit to my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. If you prefer PayPal, you can also find links to it in the description box of the interview. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share the interview, leave a like, hit the subscription button, and comment on it. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litska, Anne Blanchett, Pererga Larson, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Anis Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whiting, Bernardo Wolf, Tim Hollis, Henry Kalenius, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Bosch, Bo Weingart, Becker Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windegar, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zoop, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Thomas Trumbull, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Pinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Ugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Omari Hickson, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Ala Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslam Bullet, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solan, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Miran B, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Max Bailby, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Ellman, my producers, Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Sergio Codriano, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas France, and Niruban Balachandran, and my executive producers, Michelle Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, and Matthew Lavender. Thank you for all.